Our goal is to introduce a name that is incredibly important for Russian theater of yesterday, very important for Russian theater of today, and really important for Russian theater of tomorrow, and hopefully all over the world, just because it is not a secret that Russian theater had such tremendous influence upon theater training in this country and also in many other places. So everything that comes from Russia is obviously met with a lot of attention and concentration. And the name that I'm about to introduce to you today, although for some of you it's not going to be entirely new, is a tremendously important name. And of course there's always a mystery in terms of why this name of a man who has been dead since 1953 is introduced finally to the Russian theater in all force and also to international theater in the 21st century. So that is part of the kind of mystery that we would have to try and solve here. But the fact that this is continuation of the classical Russian tradition that is actually suffering in Russia today and is also on the crossroads, I think, internationally, is something that is incredibly important, I think. So let us start with the name that has been mentioned here a couple of times already, in the name of Konstantin Stanislavski, one of the most influential Russian figures of theater who dominated and continues to dominate theater training, certainly in the United States, to a certain degree through some American disciples, is very popular in the UK as well, including people who are saying that they're doing Stanislavski himself, although nobody today probably teaches Stanislavski. Largely what they're teaching is Meisner or perhaps Stella Adler or Otto Hagen or Lee Strasberg. So all of these people who interpreted, reinterpreted, maybe sometimes misinterpreted Stanislavski in the United States and suddenly became incredibly important and incredibly popular, and even infiltrated British theater schools somehow. So this is the starting point, which I think is incredibly important, which will help us understand why introduction of one of these forgotten Stanislavski's disciples or concealed Stanislavski's disciples is so important, just because of the kind of tremendous amount of interpretation and influence that Stanislavski inspired. So the name is Nikolai Demidov, or for those of you who are into Russian patronymics, that spoil Anna Karenina and all other Russian literature for you, because you begin to lose tracks, right, of Russian names when patronymics are being introduced. So Nikolai Vasilyevich Demidov, right? So we'll stick to Nikolai Demidov. So this extraordinary man was born in December of 1884 in a provincial Russian town of Ivanovo-Voznesensk. This town is actually known for two things: textile industry, certainly, for those who are not into arts, but also it was a home of one of the most advanced and prolific and influential Russian popular theaters. And this popular theater of Ivanovo-Voznesensk was headed by Vasily Demidov. And those of you who are really into patronymics already figured out that that must be the father of Nikolai Demidov. So he was a playwright, praised by Ostrovsky himself. He was a very talented director, teacher also, because obviously he had to teach actors who were not even necessarily actors, because we're talking about amateur theatricals. He also produced that theater for many decades. In the city of Ivanovo-Voznesensk, until now, there is a street dedicated to Vasily Demidov, on the basis of actually him introducing this incredibly influential and really high-class popular theater, as they call them in Russia. So it is into this family that Nikolai Demidov is born at the very end of the 19th century. So theater was in his blood, definitely. He spent his childhood backstage. He saw his father, who was tremendous influence, rehearsing, working with actors, both at the theater and at home as well. He saw every performance. And it's interesting because sometimes people think that theater in Russia is concentrated in Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's not exactly so, because there are tremendously powerful provincial troops, including popular companies, that are so good that sometimes when these provincial audiences came to Moscow dreaming to see Moscow Art Theatre and Stanislavski's productions, they came back disappointed. They said, we were expecting more. Actually, our actors are kind of better. I mean, they didn't dare to say it, right? But they kind of thought it. So to say that, this is provincial city and popular theater and therefore, it's not important, we can't. So Nikolai Demidov was very sickly as a kid. He was basically sentenced by doctors to a wheelchair. And you will realize from what I'm about to tell you that he was a very radical person. And it's quite obvious that he was quite radical already in his childhood. Having been told that he is not going to be able to walk, right, that he will spend the rest of his life in the wheelchair, he took one gun and aimed it at his chest, took another gun, aimed it at his temple, and fired both guns simultaneously, and lived. So having experienced that, he realized that probably God intended for him to keep going. Then he invented himself these physical exercises, through the use of which he nursed himself not only back to health, but to world records in heavy lifting. He's actually, holds some world records in heavy lifting. He became an athlete, and not just an athlete, but outstanding athlete. He created in the city of Ivanovo-Voznесенsk the Ivanovo-Voznесенsk chapter of the St. Petersburg Athletic Society, where he introduced his own methods of developing athletes, not only in terms of physical education, but in terms of moral education as well. So all of it, obviously, at a tender age of, sometime probably 18, 19. So he finally entered Moscow University in 1907 and trained there as a psychiatrist. So this actually is important because Nikolai Demidov is the only trained psychologist and psychiatrist among all of the masters of the Russian theater. Needless to say, Stanislavski speaks of psychology. Michael Chekhov, Vakhtangov, they speak of psychology. But between you and me, they don't really know what they're talking about, right? I mean, sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. When Demidov speaks of human psychology, he really knows what it is he's talking about. It is not only fundamental Moscow University education, but also keeping track of the latest developments of psychological thought and practice, obviously, throughout the rest of his life, from the time he graduates in 1907 to the time of his death in 1953. And there's a lot of very important Russian psychologists whose names also will be mentioned today, that he is personally in touch with, in connection with his books and in connection with his acting practice and theories. So simultaneously with his interest in medicine and his interest in psychology, he also becomes incredibly active in yoga and in many other Asian esoteric disciplines. Similar disciplines to yoga obviously exist in many esoteric cultures, including Japanese and Chinese. Also later, when he graduates from Moscow University, he's practicing at one of the most advanced clinics in Moscow, headed by the famous Dr. Plitnev. And simultaneously, he learns Tibetan medicine and becomes a practicing doctor at the Badmaev clinic. Tibetan medicine was used, and Badmaev was used by the Tsar's family at the time, trying to heal the heir to the throne. And needless to say for that, Badmaev was executed by Stalin in the early 1930s, and Tibetan medicine, as many advanced, as many non-traditional, as they call them now, medicines that use certain spiritual practices, Tibetan medicine obviously became forbidden. So, in addition to serious study of philosophy, psychology, psychiatry, also practical background in yoga and many other esoteric disciplines, including, as we realize now, also the theories of Rudolf Steiner, because he knew Steiner thoroughly, but for obvious reasons in the Soviet Union, he could not leave a lot of traces in his archive, with references to Steiner, because again, it was completely forbidden, but nevertheless, some references to Steiner also survived. So, this is a man who in 1907 meets in Moscow also through athletic kind of pursuits, and in this case it was wrestling school by Russian Olympic champion Petlisinski, where Demidov is wrestling. He meets a name that will tell something to everybody who is really interested in Russian theater, Leopold Sulerzhitsky. Leopold Sulerzhitsky was the closest associate of Stanislavski, co-director of several important Moscow Art Theatre productions, and the founder of the first studio of the Moscow Art Theatre. The first studio of the Moscow Art Theatre is really Moscow Art Theatre School that Demidov will be heading later. The inspiration behind it, the brain behind it, the heart behind it was Leopold Sulerzhitsky. Leopold Sulerzhitsky was certainly Stanislavski's right hand, and a man who was not fully admitted into the Moscow Art Theatre because Stanislavski's collaborator Vladimir Neverovich Danchenko was simply very jealous of everyone who was trying to collaborate with Stanislavski closely. But Sulerzhitsky, just to explain to you the importance of that name, when Gordon Craig comes to Moscow to direct his famous Moscow Art Theatre production of Hamlet, there are actually 3 directors working on the piece: Craig, Stanislavski, and Sulerzhitsky. But because of certain vanity, or I guess we can say that, when it came to issuing a poster for Moscow Art Theatre's Hamlet, Craig said that he doesn't want the name of Sulerzhitsky to be on the poster. He was okay sharing directing credit with Stanislavski, right, who is by that time already well known in Europe, right? But who is that guy Sulerzhitsky? So they scratched the name of Sulerzhitsky. So that's the story of Sulerzhitsky. Nevertheless, he was the one introducing Demidov to Stanislavski in the same year, 1907, the year when he himself met with Demidov. By that time, Stanislavski and Sulerzhitsky are seriously interested in the practical development of what is known as Stanislavski system, and in all of these interpretations that we mentioned, known as method, right, in the United States specifically. And they're very much interested in taking it a step further. Because if you remember the first Chekhovian productions of the Moscow Art Theatre, they're really built upon the principle of external realism, creating the resemblance of everyday life through lighting, sound, lifelike blockings where actors for the first time stood with their backs to the audience sometimes, right? So creating an illusion of everyday life on stage. But very soon Stanislavski understood that this is not enough, and that he should be actually looking toward finding the way of actually truthfully living on stage. That kind of trend of theater that he later called переживание, and the best way to translate it probably is experiencing. So that is not a new introduction by Stanislavski. All of the greatest actors of all time, including Garrick, for example, were actually actors of experiencing. In Russia, it is the great Yermolova, the great Machalov, the tragedians. It is certainly Leonora Duse in Italy. So all of these actors who, instead of presenting the role, lived the role. So to create the internal technique and to create certain science, if you wish, behind the school of experiencing is something that Stanislavski considered to be his chief goal, and Sulizhitsky was supposed to implement it. Both of them tremendously needed Demidov because at that point there were no exercises, there were no practical means of teaching, they were just trying to figure out how do you train an actor, how do you train an actor who could actually live on stage. So Demidov, with his knowledge in psychiatry, in psychology, in esoteric disciplines, in philosophy, was actually really important source of information. So starting in 1911, 3 years after the meeting, probably starting really in the summer of 1910, Demidov begins to experiment with Stanislavski technique, sometimes back in home with his brother, who was a very talented actor in Ivanovo-Voznесенsk, and as a scientist, and he certainly was a scientist, documenting the results of his experiments and sending them to Stanislavski. Stanislavski's archive at the Moscow Art Theatre today contains dozens of reports and very serious studies undertaken by Demidov that are not part of the Demidov archive that is kept in St. Petersburg, because Demidov actually for many decades supplied Stanislavski with scientific data and also results of his own experiments. So that is also important because later on Stanislavski is going to appoint Demidov the first editor of a book known as An Actor Prepares, which is kind of a theatrical Bible for contemporary actors. In actuality, it's just a translation, right? The real title of the book is An Actor's Work on Self, right? Not An Actor Prepares. And current, more current translations, of course, read that, An Actor's Work on Self. So, but I understand why Elizabeth Hapgood, when issuing this book for English-speaking audiences, changed the translation, because I'm sorry, Working on Self is not a very popular title. Right? Nobody wants to work on self. Right? So An Actor Prepares is a little bit more sparing, I suppose. Right? So that is, that most pivotal book also has a lot to do with Demidov. So when we begin to, realize the influence of Demidov upon Stanislavski, it's interesting to look at the preface to An Actor Prepares. Let's call it An Actor Prepares, right? So not to scare actors among us. This preface to An Actor Prepares has never been actually translated into English, because no matter who issues Stanislavski's texts in English, they kind of skip the introduction, because they probably consider this introduction to be more formal. At least that's what Benedetti quoted as a reason why he skipped it. But nevertheless, this is original author's introduction. So in that introduction, people who are reading it today are stumbling into this very peculiar paragraph, where Stanislavski extends sincere gratitude to Nikolai Vasilievich Demidov, who was helping him with the creation of this book. So at this point, everybody reading is surprised. So who is Demidov? He gave me, Stanislavski continues, valuable guidance, materials, and examples to illustrate my points. He critiqued my book and exposed my mistakes. Valuable guidance, exposed mistakes. Who is the guy, right? Who dared? Stanislavski is God, everybody knows it, right? Who is Demidov? So, but of course, through political reasons, this paragraph was overlooked by lots of scholars in Russia and simultaneously by lots of scholars in the West, because as much as scholars in the West, Stanislavski scholars, were trying to be independent, nevertheless, of course, all of their sources, because not all of them even knew Russian, all of their sources are coming mostly from Russian scholarship. There's not a lot of independence, Western scholarship. So what's happening in this case is again a mystery. So how is it possible that a man who guided Stanislavski and dared to expose mistakes is not at all known? So, but let's keep plowing forward, and we probably will find out at the end, what is going on and why it happened. So by 1919, Stanislavski manages to convince Demidov to drop medicine, despite very kind of successful medical career, and to dedicate himself entirely to theater. I think that Also in 1919, Stanislavski doesn't really teach without Demidov, because Demidov is present at every class and begins to teach on his own as well. He becomes, in the also late teens, the head of the 4th studio of the Moscow Art Theatre. So if you remember, I mentioned the 1st studio, out of which come names like Michael Chekhov, for example, like Evgeny Vakhtangov, the name that was mentioned here today as well, Richard Boleslavsky, also very influential teacher. So these are all students of the 1st studio, taught by Solzhenitsyn and then taught by Vakhtangov. Demidov becomes head of the 4th studio. I'm not going to bother you with the 2nd and the 3rd studio. But what happens is that by the early 20s, while planning to go abroad to Europe and most importantly to the United States with the company, Stanislavski is establishing the Moscow Art Theatre School that he sees as a continuation of that work with the Stanislavski system that was started by the 1st studio of the Moscow Art Theatre, headed by Solzhenitsyn. He's looking for a teacher, but unfortunately by then Solzhenitsyn is dead. He died in 1916. Vakhtangov is dead. He died in 1922. And the only surviving out of 3 teachers of the Stanislavski technique is actually Demidov. And you might ask, what about Stanislavski, right, himself? And here is another mystery that we have to unveil, and a secret we have to kind of expose. Stanislavski never taught his technique, ever. He never taught a course in the Stanislavski system. He used these methods in rehearsal work, but he never entered that fictional classroom that he describes in An Actor Prepares, and he never led a group of students through training dedicated to the so-called Stanislavski system. Solzhenitsyn did it first, Vakhtangov did it second, and then finally, when in 1921 the School of the Moscow Art Theatre is opened, that is seen as continuation of the 1st studio, it was Demidov who began the work. Being a #1 specialist in the Stanislavski technique by then, and being really a stickler for detail and a scientist, Demidov begins to teach by the book. The way that the system has been developed up till then, this is how he begins to teach. And just to remind you how the system was developed, the idea behind the system is that an actor, in order to create on stage, has to be inspired. Not a bad idea overall. How do you get inspired, right? Okay, how do you get inspired? Well, you enter a creative state, says Stanislavski. Yeah, I suppose, right? Great. So how do you enter creative state? Well, says Stanislavski, you see, creative state consists of elements. Okay, so what are these elements? Concentration of attention, right? Relaxation of muscles, physical release, imagination of fantasy, communion with the partner, right? And there are several others, right? So how do you train this? Well, you train this separately. First you kill yourself working on your concentration of attention, right? Then you kill yourself developing imagination, then you continue with communion, and so on and so forth. And by the time you've trained in each element, which, if you're remembering An Actor Prepares, that's exactly what's happening there. They're spending months training every element of the so-called system separately, right? And so by the time that you actually train all of them, they miraculously come together and constitute the so-called creative state. And when you're in the creative state, well, then just, forget the technique, just go and create, right? Everything is fine. And so that's exactly what Demidov is doing. Needless to say that people like Solzhenitsyn, people like Vakhtangov, they went around doing it the way that Stanislavski taught it, but introducing their own techniques. Not that they noticed that they introduced their own techniques, but, creative people tend to do it. Demidov, being a scientist, wants to prove that it works. And the more he works with the students, the worse they become. Stanislavski, when he comes back from America, is quite inspired because, boy, they can talk about Stanislavski system and they can just say everything about it, but they're not as talented as they were when they were accepted. which still happens in theater schools sometimes. So Demidov is completely dissatisfied, but at the same time, in 1921, he stumbles accidentally into an exercise that is going to become really the foundation of the new technique, of the Demidov technique, or Demidov school of acting. He really called it school of acting. Michael Chekhov called it technique, Stanislavski called it system, Listrar's method, right? But for Demidov, it's the school, the Demidov school, really. So it's interesting, you know, we could do a whole lecture about why they called it differently, right? But we'll skip that lecture. Continue. So Demidov stumbles into that very strange and interesting exercise, which some in this room has already experienced, called the Demidov etudes. They're completely different from the so-called Stanislavski etudes. In the Stanislavski etude, you are told that, you know, your name is such and that your partner is your brother, right? You're told that you're supposed to borrow $3 from your brother to buy cigarettes or whatever, right? You're told exactly what your background is, you're told about all the given circumstances, you're told what your objective is, and if, you know, you're really adventurous, even what your super objective might be, and then you go on stage to improvise the lines. Demidov does a completely different thing. He says, why do actors need to improvise lines when for the most part they're written by Shakespeare, Chekhov, and a couple of other people who kind of pretty competent, right? So when you do a Demidov etude, it's completely different. You are given a text, and the text can be as simple as, how do you like this weather? The weather is great. You're not told at all who you are. You're not told who the partner is. You're not told the relationship between you. You're not told your objective. You're just given the text, and then through very specific technique of memorizing the lines, emptying of the lines, which is a very important thing borrowed by Demidov from some esoteric disciplines, and greenlighting particular psychophysical impulses, suddenly all of this is created on stage. You become a character, the partner becomes another person, relationships are formed, circumstances are formed, backstory is formed, the so-called biography. So suddenly the etude creates that life in which you're actually really living, attributing everything that is happening to yourself, and fully standing behind what you're doing, but at the same time transforming and becoming different, right? So when Demidov stumbled into these etudes, he actually sometimes would go around and ask his students, and lots of his students were well versed in the Stanislavski system. He asked them to talk to him about what is it that they really, you know, admire about this etude, about this improvisational exercise. And one of them would say, well, it's amazing how concentrated these people are, right? I think concentration is the most. And the second person would say, no, but the fantasy, look, the imagination, right? But what about communion? Look at the communion, right? Look at the great freedom and muscular release. So apparently all the damn elements were inside, and nobody worked on elements. Apparently the level of imagination, the level of concentration, the level of release that actor is capable of when they're led immediately towards the subconscious is completely sufficient for the beginning exercises, for the foundation. And so Demidov came to Stanislavski and said, we've got it wrong, we have to teach completely differently. Stanislavski almost had a fit. What do you mean differently? Without elements. What do you mean without elements? No concentration? No. No objective? No. What about action? Go. Demidov gets fired from every school where he ever taught and spends about 5 years unemployed. Such was the power of not only Stanislavski's system, but Stanislavski himself. So, which was a blessing in disguise, although, you know, as all of us starving artists know, it's kind of not very convenient to not have money. He actually used 5 years to begin to write what is there before us, obviously an abridged version, but nevertheless, the 5 books that he wrote, the foundation to these 5 books was laid during that time between approximately 1927 and 1932. Simultaneously, he continued developing his technique. Not only he taught it now, but his students taught it. Among them was a woman by the name of Elena Morozova, who is known to Stanislavski scholars because she took all of the Stanislavski's, she recorded all of the Stanislavski's rehearsals that he conducted in the 30s. And so she transcribed them. But she also was an actress and a teacher, and so taught by Demidov at the 4th studio, she started teaching according to the Demidov technique. Demidov oversaw the training. Demidov was a very interesting guy, as you are beginning to realize, because as a scientist he understood an experiment should be pure. He knew very well that sometimes students are progressing not because of the training, but despite the training. Happens because of natural talent, right? That can persevere and overcome even the worst training, right? Happens for many reasons. So which is why very often, especially in the 30s and 40s, so I'm sorry I'm jumping ahead, but I guess it's necessary, he would come to a theater school. So this is after he reconciled with Stanislavski and was restored in all of his positions. He would come to a theater school and he would say, I'd like to teach your students. And they would say, oh my God, what an honor, right? Because #1 specialist in the Stanislavski technique, clear. He would continue under one condition. Here all these heads of schools would grow sad and said, we understand, yes, you want our best students. He looked at them and said, no, I want your worst students. I want the students that you're about to cut. Okay, well, great people can be crazy, right? And so they would give him these students from different groups that were about to be cut. In a couple of months at the open showing, these students would work significantly better than the rest of the group. So A, he didn't score any popularity among other teachers, that's for sure, right? B, he really proved that the technique was working. It wasn't the student talent, right? So the group that I'm talking about, guided by Morozova, was not assembled from professional actors. These were people who worked during the day in offices, and then at night gathered and under Morozova's guidance and Demidov's supervision, just for about 2-3 hours an evening, about 3 maybe days a week, they were just training. And at the end of 3 months of training, they invited Stanislavski to see the work. Stanislavski looked at the work and said, what is going on? Do you realize that they're ready to start working on a play? Usually, the students are not ready to start working on a play after a whole year of training. This is 3 months of training, not professional actors, really amateurs, right? And then on other occasion he said, these people could tomorrow be admitted to the Moscow Theatre. Here he started getting very interested, and Demidov's destiny changed completely. He was restored in all of the schools, he becomes the director of the Stanislavski Opera Theatre. He is now appointed the editor of An Actor Prepares, the first editor of An Actor Prepares, right? But unfortunately, throughout this very significant work on An Actor Prepares, Demidov continued to introduce his ideas. And finally, he made Stanislavski write the 9th final chapter of the book, An Actor Prepares, on the subconscious, which was not planned by Stanislavski at all. And in this book, in this chapter, he made Stanislavski make a statement. I could say clearly that this is Demidov making Stanislavski write. I will quote, perhaps not, verbatim, but because it's translation from Russian anyway, right? Any translation is not going to be verbatim. Unlike other teachers, writes Stanislavski in that final chapter, I believe that students, beginner actors, should be led immediately to the subconscious from the first lesson by passing the work on elements. Moreover, if you do not do that, then the only way you're going to know the system is in theory. And now imagine, you probably remember how the book is written, right? The book is written as a fictional class that is working under the guidance of the teacher Tartsov and the assistant, and so they've been training for a year. This is the end of the first year of training, right? So imagine that for an entire year you've been working on all the elements separately, as in the book, right? concentration of attention separately, imagination separately, right? Then you worked on communion, then you relaxed your muscles, right? And so on and so forth. Wonderful. And then at the very, very last class, during the very last class, your professor comes to you and says that I believe that a student should be led immediately to the subconscious by passing the elements. So the student sitting in this classroom is saying, so does it mean that everything that we've been doing up till this moment was wrong? Yes. Does it mean that we were, and then he says, if you work that way, you're going to train in mistakes. Right, so does it mean we've been training in mistake? Yes. So what's going on? What's going on is very simple. Stanislavski is going to, become 75 soon. His American publisher, Elizabeth Hapgood, has been waiting for that book for decades now, right? The Russians are also pressing him to do it. Demidov shows to Stanislavski that the final chapter contradicts the previous 8. No matter how much they tried to make all ends meet, and Demidov helped him to try to make ends meet, just things didn't add up together. It was clear that the final chapter was completely contradicting the first 8 chapters. He didn't have time to rewrite the book. So instead he fired Demidov. Simpler option, right? I mean, rewriting the book or firing the editor. So Demidov is fired. Fortunately, in 1934, when they have this conversation, and Demidov is fired as an editor of An Actor Prepares, and I read to you what is left of Demidov in An Actor Prepares, except lots of work that we don't know exactly, and some scholars will sometime trace that influence. But ultimately, what happens here is, what people know now about Demidov's participation is that paragraph dedicated to Demidov. But fortunately this time Stanislavski doesn't fire Demidov from all positions, teaching positions. He continues to be director of the Stanislavski Opera Theatre. When Stanislavski dies and hands the Opera Theatre to Meyerhold, a very unlikely heir for those of you who know Russian theatre, Meyerhold writes in a letter that before Stanislavski's death he spoke with Stanislavski, and the only man who understands the system, according to him, is Nikolai Demidov. So they didn't really part ways, right? They continued to collaborate. But the work on the book was given to a different editor, and by that time it was about something else. It's about trying to make sure that certain references to spirituality and to psychology and the word soul in a book that is about to be printed in 1938 actually in the Soviet Union are actually preserved. So it's a completely different battle, because just to say soul, to say the word soul in the Soviet society at that point is considered to be a crime. So Demidov survived this blow. What he didn't survive is Stanislavski's disciples. Disciples, if you notice, sometimes tend to be a little bit narrower than the masters. So when Stanislavski died, the disciples of Stanislavski did everything within their power to again get Demidov fired from every position that he ever held. They did again everything within their power to completely erase his name from the history of the Moscow Art Theatre and from the history of Russian theatre at large. They drove him to self-exile in Siberia during the Second World War, where he first finds himself in the Soviet Karelia, Karelo-Finnish Republic. It's a republic in the north of Russia where Finnish language is spoken actually as well as Russian. And so he heads there a National Theatre of Karelia. It's a place that I'm planning to visit this fall, because they still remember Demidov, because he stages a version of A Doll's House, Ibsen's A Doll's House there. He titles it Nora. The production is so extraordinary that the Russian Theatre Society sends 2 of their top theatre critics from Moscow to Karelia to see the production. The actress Iria Vitanen, young the Karelian actress who is playing the role of Nora, is compared to great Komissarzhevskaya, to one of the greatest Russian tragic actresses. When these critics see the work, they come back to Moscow and fly Demidov to Moscow, and they gather a special assembly of the Russian Theatre Society, where Demidov presents his findings, how he actually directed this production. And at the end of this assembly, they decide that this performance should be immediately brought to Moscow so that Russian directors in the capital could study from Demidov, right? But Demidov's destiny is very tragic. Approximately 2 months after that, Ilya Vitanin, who was playing the role of Nora, commits suicide, and the production is no longer. What follows for Demidov is the island of Sakhalin, where he's heading a company. His health, by that time he's not a young man, his heart is not surviving very well in the conditions of the far north. He's moved to the Buryat-Mongol Republic, where, you know, it's still north, but a little bit more sparing, which is his final teaching assignment. Buryat-Mongol National Theatre and the school associated with it is his final teaching assignment. He comes back to Moscow in 1949, basically to die. He spends another 3 years at his Moscow Art Theatre apartment, where he tries to publish the books. By then, he already finished 3 books, and he has 2 more books coming. The final 2 books are not dedicated to the basics, to the foundation. They're dedicated to the heightened levels of actors' creativity, to what is needed in order to be able to play tragedy, in order to be able to play Shakespeare and not just be loud, but actually be passionate, right? And sometimes even very quiet and still passionate, right? So something that Demidov considered to be a revival of the work of the great tragedians, Salvini, Duse, Komissarzhevsky in Russia, Yermolova in Russia, Moisey, the German Albanian tragedian of the 20th century. The secrets that were completely lost, the secrets of the so-called actors of the gut, were revealed by the Demidov, which is often considered to be an oxymoron, because the very thing about the gut is that it doesn't have a technique. So Demidov demystified it. He showed that inspiration has a very precise technique, and that people like Garrick, for example, they actually had a technique, and they were doing something very specific and very particular, or not doing something very specific and very particular, when they flew to these heights of tragic passion, right? Something that our actors today completely lost. Just to illustrate, you know, the kind of examples that Demidov used for his heightened level of technique, I will talk to you about an episode that happened at the Bolshoi Theatre before Bolshoi Theatre was used exclusively for opera and ballet. Malay Theatre, right next to Bolshoi in Moscow, was built later for drama. At the time when Machalov acted, everything was happening at the Bolshoi Theatre. The reason I'm telling you that is that Bolshoi Theatre seats at least 2,000 people, probably. So Machalov was performing in a cheap German melodrama where he played a husband who is very sickly and instead of getting better, keeps getting worse and worse and worse, despite the attempts by his loving wife and his best friend to cure him. And so at the end of the second act, this man, played by Machalov, sits in front of the mirror and shaves himself. And suddenly in the mirror he sees how back there his loving wife and his very best friend, they take poison, they put that poison into his soup, they very carefully mix it, they're caring, nice people. And so as he's, no wonder he's getting worse, right? So having seen that, Machalov, who was seated at the time, started rising, started getting up gradually. With him silently stood up the 2,000 people of the Bolshoi Theatre. The curtain was closed. They stood for another 3-4 minutes. Then they gradually started coming too, but they did not remember when they stood up, how. And they started looking around at each other, just seeing that everybody else is standing. And then it took another 5 minutes for them or so to actually understand what the hell just happened. Please name not just contemporary, but 20th century actor, right, who would stood up. And anybody else would follow, let alone 2,000 people. That's the energy that these actors concentrated and either drew from the audience or drew from other sources, and then manipulated the audience to completely follow them wherever they came. And these instances like that, were not singular. So that is the heritage that Demidov is trying to publish. At least one book he was trying to publish dedicated to the first curriculum year of training based on the Demidov technique. But in between 1949, when he comes back to Moscow in 1953, he's receiving murderous reviews from critics as he's trying to publish the books. And at that time, in order to publish a book, you had to solicit the so-called internal reviews. They were basically peer evaluations. Peer evaluations are murderous. He's being accused of mysticism. You know, he's being accused of spiritualism. He's being accused of physiologism. He's being accused of everything that is even imaginable. And one of these internal reviews ends this way: if this individual is practicing at any Soviet theatrical institution, his work should be immediately seized. I think that one was written already when Demidov was gone, when his students were trying to publish the books. Thankfully, Khrushchev saw the period after the death of Stalin, when, you know, Khrushchev went to kind of criticize Stalin, perhaps not fully, but somewhat, you know, and that resulted in this period of so-called thaw, when, you know, the political system started actually allowing certain things that were not possible in the 50s. In 1965, one of the books that Demidov prepared for publication, The Art of Living on Stage, dedicated to the first year of training, finally is published in an abridged version. And then another 40 years of nothing. Because after Khrushchev comes Brezhnev, and we are in this period of stagnation, and no matter how much the students of Demidov tried to do anything to publish the books, it was impossible. Finally, in 2004, in St. Petersburg, the publication began of the 4-volume heritage of Demidov, and this 4th-volume heritage is what I ultimately translated in this volume, called Nikolai Demidov Becoming an Actor-Creator, abridged version of these 4 volumes. 5 books, 4 volumes, additional materials, published from 2004 to 2009 in St. Petersburg. This triggered final realization among the Russian theater professionals and students of the size of that figure. That triggered, you know, the introduction, or in many cases, reintroduction of Demidov into the curriculum of the Russian Theater University in Moscow, the Theater Institute in St. Petersburg, except that when they were introducing Demidov back, they had nobody to teach it. Because the students were long gone, right? They were not actually allowed to practice. And so as a result, there was absolutely nobody to do the work. So this is probably where we unfortunately have to come back to me, right? Which is where we started. It was actually the fortune of mine that I already in 2005 got hold of the first 2 volumes, and then through the generosity of the Russian publishers received the materials of the final volume of the Heightened Technique in America, received it a year before the Russian publication. So don't ask me why they did it, right? Because when you're publishing new material, you usually don't share it with, you know, other theater scholars who could actually publish it before you, right? So, but they did it. And so gradually I restructured my curriculum that included obviously pure Stanislavski, Vakhtangov, Michael Chekhov. I restructured that curriculum seriously to introduce Demidov, and in about 2 years, beginning in 2008, I started working exclusively with the Demidov technique. Andrei told you about the program where I teach. It is the Florida State University Asolo Conservatory for Actor Training, one of the top 10 theater schools, acting schools in the country, top 25 in the English-speaking world. It's a serious program where we audition, you know, thousands of people and select 12. So it was a wonderful platform for me for laboratory exploration. But because Demidov was yielding such extraordinary, quick, and decisive results, unlike Russia, where these results were probably more of a problem than a blessing, in America it actually turned out quite differently, because I was introducing completely different technique, completely different school, but I was ultimately allowed to do it. In America, of course, nobody cared whether it's Stanislavski or not, and whether it contradicts Stanislavski or not. Very pragmatic considerations. It works, let's do it, right? It doesn't work, throw it away, right? So in Russia, it's not exactly that. In Russia, you have to also prove that Stanislavski has something to do with it. Until now, actually, believe me or not. So, so now I've been working with this technique for close to 10 years, and brought it from the classroom to the rehearsal hall and to the creation of the performance and the role. And as a result, I've been actually doing lots of teaching in Moscow and in St. Petersburg and in other places, just because Russian theater that lost Demidov eventually is now re-importing it from America and asking American teacher, as ironic as it is, to come back and teach it. And obviously for me it's a wonderful way to also go back to my roots and to kind of try to give back what was first, what was lost in Russian theater. And a great way, I think, to bring Russian theater also, and obviously all other cultures, theatrical cultures that are influenced by it, great way to bring it back to these roots of this really profound, deep psychological theater that also has this possibility to go into the heightened theater, into the theater of heightened tragedy, into the theater of heightened comedy, farce, anything, because even to play a comedy, right, you're much better with a tragedian than with a comic actor, because only a tragedian can be so serious about these trifles, right, that it becomes incredibly funny, right? So this actor, to whom the final book is dedicated, the affective actor, as Demidov calls him, the final book is titled The Psychotechnique of the Affective Actor. Affective for him is passionate. Affective for him is Machalov, who could stand up and bring with him 2,000 people. Affective is ultimately a tragedian. Tragedians who became extinct with the development of the 20th century directorial school, right? That is incredibly analytical and ultimately doesn't know how to give true creative freedom to the actor, and therefore begins to gradually destroy the art of the tragedians, because the main quality that Demidov develops in an actor is actually freedom, which happens to be the main quality underneath, so to speak, at the foundation of the work of the tragedians. Contemporary actor, even if you give them freedom, for the most part wouldn't even know what to do with it. The way that I arrived at it before Demidov is by directing. And I remember distinctly I was directing a scene between Raskolnikov and Sonichka from Crime and Punishment. This Pushkin house, I might as well bring up all the Russian classics. So, and I would watch the scene, and at the end of the scene I would critique it. And I would say, well, this was all good, yeah, but at that particular moment, wouldn't it be nice if you took her by the hand? Or at that particular moment, would it be nice if instead of moving closer to her, you would actually move away from her? And when I said these things, actors were saying, this is exactly what I wanted to do. Why didn't you do it? Well, I thought my character wouldn't do that. Or I thought you wouldn't like it. So, I mean, there are these kind of things. So, and then I understood, of course, I'm no director. I don't just see something that I see what they want to do. And when they do it, it convinces me 100%. Because when you really stand behind what you are doing, boy, you are convincing. And when you want to do one thing and do another, which is what most of actors do, unfortunately, right? Boy, it is not really convincing. And so there is no such thing as truth. That truth that we keep talking about and keep seeking, it doesn't exist. What exists is the kind of truth that is singular. When I want to do this and I do this, and the character in me is doing it, and that horrible split, it's also truthful. By the way, in life we live like that all the time. When I come into my boss's office, do I tell him what I really think? Probably not, right? I try to look smarter than I am or dumber than I am, right? I I'm not really being honest, I'm not really being singular, right? So that split in between what I want to do, except in life it's serving certain, process of, or purpose rather, of self-preservation. But on stage, this technique is really shooting you in the foot, because if in life your job is to survive, on stage your job is to perish, and if you don't perish, I'm sorry, it's a very boring play, right? And so this technique of freedom, first and foremost, how to develop a free actor who is completely in tune with their impulses, that technique that Demidov develops in an actor from the very beginning of the training to the very end, except it gets more complicated on one end, on the other end it gets simpler. But I would say that probably we've reached the part of my talk, because we're approximately at an hour mark, right? Wow, exactly at an hour mark, right? Because what I wanted to do, and maybe I should have told you, right, but I didn't, so I'm going to introduce this idea now. What I would like to do really is, having told you some of the things that I consider to be important, to really maybe use the last half hour that we've got for a conversation, because I'm sure there are questions brewing, but I don't necessarily know what kind of questions they are. So if I continue speaking, I may not answer them, right? So do you feel that that is maybe a good idea? Just to open the floor and to, to continue conversation more like a dialogue. Because needless to say, even when you talk about freedom, and when you realize that Demidov didn't have blockings, fixed blockings in his productions, right? You realize that there's a lot of people who begin to scream bloody murder, right? And film people get really excited because they say, I'm sorry, you're going to give them freedom, so he is going to, in one take, he is going to put that glass of water here, right? And then in another take, he is going to not put it there and just stand with that glass of water. How am I going to edit the two damn takes, right? So, which is a very interesting question, by the way. Because I had experience of filming one of my productions, also coincidentally based on Ibsen's The Lady from the Sea, where we could not use any of the different takes that were, shot on different days. But nevertheless, actually, that is the problem that is very easily solved, right? Very easily solved. So, and Demidov's, of course, does something very interesting with this. So these questions are the questions, anything that you may be curious about in terms of Demidov, in terms of his training. I think from this point on we might just open a dialogue, if that's okay.
Just going to the history of it, I'm very curious, for instance, when you were training and doing your degree, was known about Demidov?
None.
None? So
None.
You never mentioned?
None. I mean, there were people who would discover his book printed in 1965, and so they would come to their masters. In Russia they're called masters, right?
Yeah.
Masters. So they're disciples of Stanislavski, and so on and so forth, right? So they would come and they would say, oh my God, right? Look what I found. Action doesn't exist, right? So what did you find? Demidov? Please, right? Please. So, and when you are 19, 20, you so blindly believe, right, your master, who is God and Oracle and everything, that you don't even go there much, clearly. And also you want to graduate, right? You want your diploma. So it was enough, to hear from the master, please never bring up that name, right? Why? Because yes, he did say that, at the very foundation of Stanislavski system, there is the so-called truth, right, which will be ultimate truth for as long as the earth stands, that at the foundation of the actor's creative process lies the so-called action, right? And with the action everything starts, and with the action everything ends. Demidov, being a psychiatrist and being a psychologist, figured out very quickly that this is nonsense. If I suddenly go to that window and commit to an action of closing the window, it has nothing to do with me wanting to go to the window and close the window. It has something to do with the draft. And if I don't perceive the draft, I'm never going to go to that window, right? If I'm just quite fine in a cold room, right? Because I'm I'm very well used to Siberian weather, right? I don't feel the draft, right? This is how it is in my native Siberia, right? So I go to that window, I'm not going to go to that window. So Demidov trains perception. Now that perception, once an actor is actually trained to perceive, immediately triggers action, which becomes, of course, a reaction and not an action, right? So doesn't start with action, it actually starts with perception. But do actors really see each other on stage? Rarely. Do actors really hear each other on stage? Rarely. When Stanislavski worked with the greatest Moscow art theater actors such as Moskvin and Kachalov, if you look at the records of these rehearsals, for the most part he is saying to them, my dear people, you don't see each other and you don't hear each other. And and Moskvin was a great actor with with an international reputation, but he was also a decent human being. So he would say, "What? Really? Oh my God! Are you serious? Oh my God! I'm committing the first year mistakes because that's what's trained in the first year of school, right?" And Kachalov, who also was a great actor but not such a nice person, would say, "How dare you? I'm Kachalov, and you're telling me I'm committing first-year mistakes, right?" But the mistakes that they commit on stage are first-year mistakes. Go to the theater, look. How many actors actually hear each other and see each other, right? And therefore go off of each other and react to each other? Very few, right? But the best actors everywhere, here and every other place, are going to be the best actors because they actually see the partner, hear the partner, and instinctually, subconsciously, creatively, therefore, react to the partner, right? So that's why he trained freedom and he trained perception. Perception and the training of perception is something that certainly connects him also with Michael Chekhov. Greg, you had a question.
My question was, if Demidov died in 53 and Chekhov in 55, it would seem to be a period of almost 50 years where they went into, the word that springs to mind is hibernation, but that's not really it.
Yeah.
I mean, Chekhov, Michael Chekhov was, it began to sort of not flower, but become more known in the year 2000 virtually, the end of around 2000. It's grown since then.
Finally published in Russia in 1985, so it's 30 years since his death, right? But if we are looking at his exile in 1928, right?
Yeah.
So it's much more,
Yeah,
28 to 85, that's a year. Yeah.
So why would you say that these two great people, these great Russians, have in a way been suppressed? What is it? Is it because, and the reason why Stanislavski has sort of blossomed in a way, and in a way you could say Freud as well, and not so much Jung, although that has all got somewhat. Is it because of this inherent fear that there is another reality besides the sense-perceptible reality?
Sure.
And as soon as we start to work with actors on this subconscious realm, although I don't know if we cut up our body where we find the subconscious, it doesn't exist physically. It exists somewhere else. It's not a physical thing. It's this inherent fear, an understandable inherent fear of the institution, of the church, and what the church has done, possibly. But I think this is altering that. The young people that I work with, they just instinctively understand this.
Right.
Instinctively understand.
Something changed in the atmosphere. Yes?
Absolutely, it's really extraordinary that when you just introduce these very simple elements of how to perceive based on Steiner's philosophy of freedom, but not conceptually, but experientially.
Right.
That's the thing. Yes, that was, we remain in concepts, and the academic world takes over. I give it about 10 years possibly. However, that's another question. So, would you say that would be the reason why that they just sort of, this black hole?
Definitely, definitely. When something is not accepted and when something is then accepted, you have to look not just at individuals, right?
Yes, the whole science.
You have to look at the whole spectrum of what's going on in philosophical thought, in political thought, and therefore probably in what's happening. Yeah, it's true that, you know, imagine the Soviet society. Let's just stick to, you know, to the ground where this was developed. Imagine the Soviet society, not even under Stalin perhaps, right, but even under Khrushchev or under Brezhnev, where at the very foundation of training there is a quality of freedom. Right? I mean, that alone is quite clear. Complete denial of anything spiritual. Now, it doesn't mean that this spirituality one day will not be, you know, tackled by scientists in a different way than it is now, right? It doesn't mean that they will not come close to recording certain energies that at the moment is undetected. But that's not the point, right? I mean, we know it works. So we don't need it detected, we don't need it qualified, you know, and quantified by science exactly. But of course, to even imagine, to even introduce the idea that something may be happening on its own, that certain things may be taking care of themselves, and that an actor should know more or less how to get out of his or her own way, right? And how not to try to actually begin to do something on top of what is already going on. So all of it was considered to be so damn mystical, right, by the Soviet propaganda, that of course it's understandable why even in 1960s, the long-lived period of, you know, half freedom, quarter freedom in the Soviet society, I mean, these techniques, be it Michael Chekhov, be it Demidov, of course, could not survive. I mean, they could be printed as, you know, at that time they would sometimes print something with a special preface, which, by the way, did happen in the case with Demidov. There was a preface by Maria Knebel, who said, on one hand, this is important, on the other hand, oh, this is very questionable. So that was the Soviet way of telling the students, this is our way to show that more than one opinion exists, but this opinion is wrong, right? And of course, I'm sorry, when I'm a student and I already need to read 3,000 books, right? If they're giving me a book that when the preface says this is wrong, I'm not going to bother for the most part, right? But the most progressive theater directors and teachers in the 1960s, of course, they all ran to each other with that book saying, did you read it? Do you understand what this means? Right? And began to develop this work, but began to develop this work in the first year training as a way of developing certain important qualities in an actor, not taking it into rehearsal work and not taking it into the work connected with performance, so not even taking it into the work connected with character development, which is so, you know, connected with scene study, right? So that is where they stopped, and they didn't understand how that freedom can be followed when everything in the play is given, right? When everything in the play is I must, right? But apparently it works there as well. Lisa.
Given the strong Russian tradition in documentary filmmaking and Demidov being a scientist, did they ever film him or his technique for him?
No. He actually said that the best way to convey his technique would be to film a classroom, to actually film it. No, he was, thank you for asking that question, because that also brings me back to his relationship with contemporary, very influential Russian psychiatrists, such as Vygotsky, for example. So they all were part of the same circle. Ukhtomsky, Vygotsky, you know, these people who are still until today studied in, you know, in schools all over the world. So he, at the time when he was editing An Actor Prepares, he would actually give these people some of the chapters from An Actor Prepares, Stanislavski's book, and they would read it and they would say, oh, this is very interesting and very new, or rather it was interesting and it was new 10 years ago. Then he would give them chapters from his book to read, and they said, oh, this is very interesting and very new, or rather will be in 10 years. Can you please hurry and publish it because I need to be able to quote you, right? So he was ahead of his time, right, in many respects. So scientific community actually was behind the 1965 publication. It wasn't the actors, it wasn't the directors, because he was a tremendous competitor, and contradiction to Stanislavski was a sentence, a death sentence then as well. But the leading Soviet Russian psychiatrists, psychologists, physiologists, and biologists were the one who wrote letters to, you know, the people in charge of publications, because you couldn't just publish in the Soviet Union back then. You had to go through party committee and, you know, government committee and so on. So they wrote the letters saying, this is serious, this must be published, because it doesn't just apply to acting actually, it applies to any sphere of human creative activity. It's, you know, really creativity, psychological creativity, or rather psychology of creativity, of the creative process is present in these books, right? So it is under the protection of these scientists that they issued the book, with preface by one of the leading scientists of that time as well.
I'm interested in how you foresee the teaching of this technique ongoing into the future, because it seems, as you said, there's, you know, thousands of people teaching elements of Stanislavski in various ways. My understanding of it is that it's so dependent on the teacher's instinct, intuition,
Correct.
maybe even psychiatric approach or psychological
Correct.
approach. That how is that going to? How do you see it being taken forward in terms of training?
It's a wonderful question. I think it's a blessing, because we know very well from the history of the Stanislavski system that it is an incredibly tricky thing in terms of the amount of misinterpretation, the amount of just complete turning almost inside out an approximation of the technique is what gradually brought us to the point where it's clear that Stanislavski technique doesn't work. It doesn't mean that it completely doesn't work. Demidov's second book is called the types of actor types, right? Where he actually shows that there are 4 predominant types in almost every creative profession, but certainly among actors. He talks about actor-imitator, emotionally willful actor, right? He talks about affective actor, 3 actor types, right? Affective meaning tragedian, and then he talks about intellectual actor, or ultimately a non-actor. Doesn't mean that they don't exist, you know, and they're doing quite fine in certain theaters and so on. But ultimately, each of these types is asking for a different school and can thrive in a different school and needs completely different training. Affective actor is not going to at all succeed if you introduce the imitative techniques, right? Emotionally willful actor is going to be able to certainly get something from the school of imitation and from the affective school, but also is going to remain within their own boundaries. An affective actor, again, it's something that just is not taught today. There is no school that is teaching an affective actor for obvious reasons, right? Because of the potential collision that there can happen between the dictator director and, you know, and that actor. So would be collision, of course. There would not be one, especially if the director is a creative person. But because of that clear division, right, there's always going to be a question in terms of, yes, you can use this technique in order to give something very precious to an imitator and to really take the emotionally willful actor to a different level, right? And that's the only technique today to use for an affective actor. But it doesn't mean that you can make an affective actor out of imitator with the use of this technique, right? Because everybody ultimately belongs to one type, although it is a huge generalization, clearly. Because who am I? I mean, I don't know who am I. I have some of the imitator, of course, I have some of the emotionally willful, and each of us has a trace of affectivity. Each of us. Some more, some less, right? And so you are right that there is a tremendous problem of just misinterpretation of Stanislavski that made that school ultimately hit a wall. which for many years scared me because I thought the same thing is going to happen with Demidov. He is blessed that he has not been discovered. Because the moment he gets discovered, right, people who have no idea what they're doing will begin to use the technique and misinterpreting it on a large scale, and before you know it, right, they'll make a laughing stock out of it. Because it does take very particular, very sensitive teacher, right, who also possesses this tremendous tactic of a pedagogue, right? Because, you know, us theater teachers, we sometimes think that we are paid in order to just expose mistakes, right? An actor is yet to open their mouth, right? Wrong, right? This is wrong, right? You're tense, right? Your left shoulder is tense, you're not concentrating, right? You don't see the part. So we keep bombarding them with these mistakes, ultimately showing different elements that have nothing to do with the whole. And we do one thing, we destroy the most important thing in an actor, we destroy their faith in themselves. Because when director or teacher say wrong before I ever even did something, I mean, believe you me, I begin to say wrong to myself before I even, you know, come up with an impulse. And so that freezes me. Demidov was completely different. He overlooked most of the mistakes. And miraculously, most of the mistakes work themselves out in the course of training. And guess what? Mistakes work themselves out, and the actor's faith in himself or herself were preserved. He didn't make them cripples who are afraid to, you know, to do anything free on stage or anything creative or spontaneous, right? So he knew very well, when it comes to teaching or directing, it is equally important what I'm not saying as what I'm saying, right? I need to know not only what to say to an actor, but most importantly, when to shut up. So that is also part of it, right? In the Demidov technique, of course, a huge tool is the so-called support. Because as an actor is doing that first exercise that we are talking about, which, by the way, is very difficult, but unlike the Stanislavski teacher who comes to the classroom and says, well, my dear beginners, you realize that you know nothing and can do nothing, right? You can't really talk, you can't really walk, you can't really communicate with each other, but we will teach you, never fear, right? Demidov teacher comes to the classroom and says, I have nothing to teach you. Because 24 hours a day you walk, talk, you communicate with each other. I really have nothing to teach you, right? 24 hours because you kind of continue doing it in your dreams, right? So it is true that for a beginner it is a bit intimidating to do all these things in front of the audience. Believe that what's going to happen next is simple. Where is it simple? I don't know who I am. I don't know who the partner is. I don't know where we are. I don't know what's happening between us, right? But by tricking them into believing it's simple, he makes them succeed immediately. But there is another important thing. He also very carefully guides them through the exercise. Before they even open their eyes, he begins to whisper, and sometimes not whisper, correct, correct, that's exactly it. Take your time when they're about to get nervous and begin to do stupid things, right? Take your time, or green light it, give it a green light when they're about to take, you know, flight, but they're afraid. So he supports them. And needless to say, in order to support an actor, you have to become that actor. You have to completely tune up with the actor and permeate them, and to completely feel when they're about to make a mistake and what mistake, and anticipate it. Because if you catch it when they're already doing it, it's too late. You have to actually anticipate it. So there's a lot of things about that school where on one hand it requires an experienced pedagogue in order for it to really bear the kind of fruit it can bear. On the other hand, the opposite is also true. The school is so damn right and true that even when they're trying to butcher it, it still yields results. And we've seen it many times when complete amateurs and people who didn't understand it actually began to work with this, and still they were producing significant tangible results. So on one hand, that bulletproof kind of knowledge of human psychology that stands behind that school, and that just makes it work, because it's based on very particular triggers that trigger your subconscious to begin creating. And on the other hand, yes, absolutely, in order to go somewhere serious and create a great piece of art, which you can use this technique to do, you have to have a very smart and very intelligent and ultimately very sensitive pedagogue as well, right? So that's why I do have hope that maybe it's not going to be turned into something that is the opposite of what it is. What other thoughts or what other questions?
You alluded to emptiness, and I'm aware that in the book there's a reference to a notion of a sort of doubleness or a double consciousness. And I want
Double
to
consciousness, yes.
say something about both of those, please.
Well, there is a very kind of slight but at the same time important thing which I mentioned. You remember probably that I said in the basic exercise, we're now talking about basic exercise, an actor repeats the lines, repeats them without any intonations, without any predetermination of what's going on, just repeats them somewhat dramatically. Then forgets the lines. I throw these lines out of my head, right? Well, you all probably know what it is like to try to get an annoying tune out of your head or annoying thought, right? So you kind of empty for a second. I don't want anything, I don't know anything, I don't feel anything. And then I go with the first impulse, not with the second, not with the third, as actors very often do, right? But with the first impulse. So all these three things are very important. The emptying is important because, of course, I have to empty the vessel in order for something then to begin to pour into the vessel, right? You know very well that if you write your wish on the sand and the wave doesn't erase the wish, it's not going to come true, right? In order for your wish to come true, the wave has to erase it, right? So that moment of emptiness is very important. Without that moment of emptiness, nothing is going to work. But what people don't always realize, and it's quite fine, because these beginners, these actors, they shouldn't know this theory. If you really begin to introduce the theory ahead of practice, it's really going to go wrong, because when I have not experienced yet something, the only way I can judge about it is using my former experience. And I begin to project my former experience that has nothing to do with what we are doing onto the new principles, and I misinterpret them entirely, right? So, needless to say, there's a reason why no talk, no word of any theory is introduced in Demidov until much later in the year, right? Much later. So we're just doing the work. So that emptiness, of course, it continues. Because as I empty myself, I let in something. And I, of course, do split. I split into an actor who observes and into the character who acts. And the more that observer is present, of course, the less creative I am, and the more that observer goes onto the back burner, and from the back burner maybe says, wow, look what's happening. Someone invaded me and somebody is doing some really crazy things, but I'm going to let that someone continue act on my behalf, right? So without the emptying and the culture of emptiness, because Demidov writes and introduces the culture of emptiness, you cannot do it. The guard in you, the critic in you, right, the conscious being has to look away. Otherwise the prisoner, the character, won't be able to escape. And if the guard is constantly keeping the sight on the door of the prison, right, no character will ever be born. It's only when the guard looks away and pretends not to notice that the character sneaks out, and then the character begins to do whatever it is the character wants to do. And you are just watching, and for the most part, remain amazed about what is going on and what this complete invader, of you, somebody who invaded you and just does mischief on your behalf, what that person is doing in you, right? But in order for that to happen, you have to be empty. You have to be completely empty. And that integral personality, as Demidov calls it, has to go away and become. It's not really a split. Later in his work, he actually introduced a much better term, doubling, right? You are doubling. It is you and the character, right? You develop another persona, ultimately. Your persona doesn't go away. It's still there. It's still watching, still observing, right? It's still saying, take your time, and it's still saying, green light it, right? But ultimately there is another persona as well. And every actor knows it. It's just, it's not necessarily taught. Good. We probably have time for one quick last question, right? If there is one. Yes.
So you mentioned that this is an abridged version of the Demidov books.
Yes.
And also that there was all these communications between Demidov and Stanislavski early on, and you seem to have a massive amount of detail in terms of the story of how these lives happened. How much more is there in terms of archive material?
Well, there is at least one more volume. I mean, we're talking about 4 volumes. You know, each volume is over 500 pages, right? 4 volumes in Russian, and at least one more volume, at least, of over 500 pages, and then possibly more. It depends on how much you publish. But the thing about this book, of course, I prepared it along with the only scholar and actually only person today. Actually, there are 2 people we know who knew Demidov, right? So one of them was one of the final students. If you remember, I told you about Buryat-Mongolian Republic, right, where he taught at the end of his life in the late 40s. So there's a lady who became, a tremendously important scholar in theater, who is still surviving, and she is probably early 90s, I'm assuming, who remembers him and actually trying to do something to promote him. And my editor for this volume, Margarita Laskina, who just turned 95, bless her soul, and is, completely present intellectually. So she was Demidov's assistant, who in the final years of his life helped him to, type his works, spoke with him, and so on. Her husband was Demidov's favorite student actor, actually also very important Russian tragedian, of whom she just published another book. So we put that together, and of course for her and for me it was very important that although this is abridged, we nevertheless do not lose the things that are absolutely essential. And moreover, it's not just our device, right, to give the English-speaking reader an abridged version because we think that they're not worthy of the full thing, right? No, we're doing the same thing in Russian. We're actually bringing out an abridged version because not every director has the guts, right, to read 4 volumes. So understanding that, we are kind of trying to take out certain repetitions, take out certain things that, yes, absolutely, once you studied this, seriously, you will want them to read the full version. There is no question about it, right? And so Russian people could, and English-speaking audience readers may have to wait a little bit. But ultimately, I can vouch that everything that is essential is there and more, because at the end of the book, there is also an 80-page glossary of terms and exercises that contains a lot of new materials from the Demidov archive that is not available in Russian. And actually, who knows when it will be available in Russian. At some point, I'll put it together and print it in Russian, obviously. But at the moment, actually, English-speaking actors and directors and teachers have advantage because they do have access to these materials that Russian don't even have. At the moment. So the book is here. It's been issued by Routledge exactly a year ago, last summer, right? Routledge also sent flyers and offered a 20% discount because this is an expensive book, unfortunately, right? So they're offering on this flyer, there is a code with a 20% discount. If you know somebody who can be interested, if you yourself are interested, please pick up the flyer, right? Unfortunately, we don't have anything for sale here, but it's okay, right? You don't want to, although this book it's handy in many ways. You can defend yourself with this. So maybe you wish you had it with you as a weapon as you're exiting, right? But ultimately, with the help of that flyer, you will be able to buy it and be sent to you with a 20% discount.
There's also an electronic copy.
And there is an electronic copy that is much less expensive. In about a year or so, I will issue through Routledge a paperback. And paperback will cost approximately what the electronic version costs. So, if you can wait another year or so, right? So there are options. There are options. Yeah. On this completely non-creative note, right? I will end it and just it was wonderful to be able to share with you this. Demidov is very interesting. Some people collect great people's final words, right? It's very interesting. Demidov's final words that he uttered before he died were Don Quixote. Thank you.